In 1961, the United States did not enter the Amazon looking for myths. It entered looking for data. Officially, the mission was routine. A joint US-Brazilian survey intended to map river systems, assess terrain stability, and evaluate long-term feasibility for communications infrastructure deep inside the western Amazon basin. Nothing classified, nothing controversial, at least on paper. What complicates the record is not what the reports say. It's what they stop saying. The earliest field logs describe repeated contact with indigenous scouts hired as navigators. These scouts did not refuse cooperation. They did not protest the mission, but they did insist on one condition that appears again and again in translated notes. Certain tributaries were not to be crossed after dusk. Others were not to be crossed at all. At first, U.S. personnel recorded this as cultural superstition. Later, entries softened the language. By the third week, the tone changes entirely. The warnings are no longer described as beliefs. They are logged as patterns: river silence, navigation drift, personnel disorientation. One declassified Brazilian Army memo from June 1961 contains a line that stands out for its restraint. Local guides demonstrate measurable distress near marked zones, regardless of briefing or incentive. Those marked zones were physical: carved posts, altered trees, changes in soil composition, boundaries that had existed long before any modern map. The tribes did not describe these areas as cursed. They described them as remembered. That distinction mattered later. The American team included military advisors, Brazilian jungle infantry, and civilian scientists operating under a research grant associated with biological field studies. The scientists were not briefed on the tribal warnings. According to after-action notes, that decision was deliberate. Command believed advanced knowledge would bias observation. By mid-July, the expedition crossed one of the restricted tributaries shortly after sunset. The engine failure that followed was not recorded as mechanical. The report simply states, propulsion ceased without detectable fault. River current increased despite unchanged conditions. Ambient noise dropped below measurable levels for approximately 40 seconds. No conclusions were drawn. What was noted repeatedly was confusion. Soldiers unable to retrace short paths. Scouts refusing to face inland while sleeping. Radio interference that did not match atmospheric patterns. Still, the mission continued. Because at that point, the warnings were inconvenient, and the data was becoming interesting. By the end of the first phase, field leadership had a decision to make. Either treat the tribal boundaries as irrelevant folklore, or accept that generations of local knowledge were pointing to something the instruments could not yet explain. They chose to proceed, and that choice set the conditions for everything that followed. What happens when a modern system ignores a boundary it does not understand and records the consequences without knowing how to interpret them? The second phase of the 1961 expedition focused on inland movement away from the main river. This is where the documentation becomes unusually detailed and unusually cautious. Standard jungle operations expect unpredictability, weather shifts, wildlife disruption, equipment decay. What the logs describe instead is consistency in the wrong direction. Multiple patrols reported identical experiences at different times of day. The forest would not gradually quiet. It would stop. Birds, insects, wind through leaves, all absent at once. The term used was not quiet, it was absence. One Brazilian captain noted that even trained soldiers instinctively froze during these events, not out of fear, but because spatial reference seemed to collapse. Distance felt wrong. Direction felt unreliable. Navigation errors increased sharply. Compasses drifted by small but persistent margins. Landmarks appeared to shift between patrols. Paths cleared in the morning showed regrowth by evening that should have taken weeks. Scientists on the team documented fungal structures spreading across roots and tree bases at a rate inconsistent with known growth models. The samples were catalogued, sealed, and shipped downriver in small batches. Here is where the tribal warnings re-enter the record. An interpreter recorded an explanation offered quietly by one of the older scouts. The forest beyond certain markers was not dangerous because it attacked people. It was dangerous because it absorbed behavior. The phrasing is important. Not bodies. Behavior. At the time, this was dismissed as metaphor. Later reports suggest it was closer to an observation. Personnel began exhibiting memory inconsistencies, small ones at first, repeating questions, forgetting short movements, confusing elapsed time. Medics attributed it to heat stress and fatigue. No evacuation was ordered. What complicates the analysis is that the scientists showed no concern. In fact, their reports indicate heightened engagement. They believed they were observing a naturally occurring networked biological system, possibly fungal, possibly microbial, that influenced animal movement through chemical signaling. That theory was not impossible. It was just incomplete. Radio operators logged static bursts that repeated in irregular but patterned intervals. No messages were decoded. Still, operators described the interference as structured rather than random. This is where command decisions become critical. Despite rising anomalies, leadership approved expansion. A semi-permanent forward site was authorized near one of the restricted zones. The justification was technical necessity. Communications required elevation and isolation from river interference. The scouts refused to sleep facing the forest once construction began. One of them left entirely. His departure is noted in a single line. Local guide withdrew cooperation prior to Phase 3. No reason recorded. By this point, the expedition had accumulated enough inconsistencies to pause. Instead, it accelerated. And the forest, according to every surviving account, began responding faster than before. What does it mean when an environment adapts more quickly than the system studying it? Phase 3 is where the historical record fractures. While expanding inland patrols, the team encountered remnants of an older installation, American in origin. This discovery was not part of the mission briefing. No prior documentation referenced a previous U.S. presence at that depth of the basin. The structures were elevated, partially flooded, and marked with faded equipment codes no longer in use by 1961. Preliminary estimates dated them to the late 1940s. That detail alone should have halted operations. Instead, it raised new questions. Why would an American research site exist in a region tribal scouts had avoided for generations? And why had it been erased from official archives? Inside the structures, personnel found laboratory tables, rusted containment cages, and paper records fused by humidity. What remained legible referenced experiments on coordinated animal behavior, signal propagation through soil, and what one page described as shared response environments. The language was cautious, controlled, uneasy. Most concerning was a repeated observation. Exposure did not impair physical function first. It altered decision-making, movement choices, route selection, withdrawal timing. One line appears multiple times in different handwriting styles. The system influences selection before awareness. No explanation follows. The tribal scouts refused to enter the structures. One interpreter recorded their reasoning simply: the place was already claimed. Disturbing it would invite attention. Scientific leadership disagreed. Samples were taken from the soil, the fungal growth, and, most controversially, from remains found in a sealed section of the facility. Dog tags identified them as American personnel. No cause of death was listed. Command authority again chose continuation over caution. Within 48 hours of the discovery, multiple patrol members exhibited advanced disorientation. One soldier walked perimeter for what he believed was hours. His watch recorded 20 minutes. Another woke near the river with no memory of leaving his post. The river itself began behaving inconsistently. Surface tension appeared abnormal. In certain pools, light behaved incorrectly. Reflections did not align with cloud cover. No one claimed the water was unnatural. They claimed it was wrong. Radio contact degraded further. Static patterns repeated more frequently. One operator described the interference as paced, as if responding to movement within the camp. At this stage, evacuation was discussed. It was not approved, because the site represented something rare, a naturally occurring system that could potentially influence human behavior without direct contact. To Cold War planners, that possibility was not frightening. It was valuable. So the mission crossed the final boundary the tribes had warned about. And after that crossing, the environment stopped merely reacting. It began initiating. What happens when a research subject starts shaping the experiment itself? The first disappearance did not look like a disappearance. A Brazilian patrol failed to return from a short reconnaissance. No distress call, no gunfire. When their position was reached, their camp was intact. Equipment stacked neatly, food untouched. Tracks led toward a narrow channel of dark water and stopped. There were no signs of struggle. The tribes had warned about this specifically. People did not vanish. They walked away. Command response was procedural. A recovery team was authorized. Movement beyond the boundary became routine rather than exceptional. From this point forward, silence events increased in frequency. Entire sections of jungle would shut down for seconds at a time. During these moments, personnel reported pressure in the ears, chest tightness, and difficulty maintaining orientation. Then the ground itself began changing. Mud that behaved like suction. Roots exposed where none had been before. Paths folding back toward previously visited areas. Compasses spinning without magnetic explanation. The scientists documented everything with growing urgency and growing enthusiasm. Their working theory proposed a distributed biological network capable of low-level influence on animal nervous systems through chemical signaling, spores, root systems, waterborne agents. The tribes had a simpler explanation. The forest remembered. Another soldier vanished, then another. In each case, the pattern was identical. No alarm, no panic, personal effects left behind. One boot returned to the riverbank, placed carefully, as if intentionally. Morale collapsed unevenly. Some men became hyper-focused. Others withdrew. A few displayed emotional flattening so severe it alarmed medics. The commanding officer requested extraction support. Air support arrived and aborted. Pilots reported visual distortion in the canopy below. Tree movement that did not align with rotor wash. One pilot described the terrain as breathing. That word does not appear in the official report. It appears in a personal memo written later. With air evacuation unavailable, command faced a choice: destroy the discovered facility and withdraw or continue data collection under deteriorating conditions. The argument was not about safety, it was about whether the system could be neutralized or replicated. That night, the silence returned longer than before. Witnesses described shapes at the edge of visibility. Not entities, distortions, human outlines that dissolved when approached. Gunfire was ineffective, bullets struck trees, sound behaved incorrectly. At this point, violence entered the record, not from the environment, but from confusion. Friendly fire incidents occurred, orders were misheard, paths overlapped. The forest did not attack. It allowed people to misjudge one another, and that distinction made accountability impossible. As dawn approached, the decision was finally made. The site would be destroyed. But by then, something else had already changed. The boundary no longer seemed to exist outside the camp. It had moved, and the camp was now inside it. The demolition was improvised, charges placed on structures, sample huts, and remaining equipment. Not all data was secured. Some samples were lost. Others were deliberately destroyed. One tribal scout volunteered to remain near the original boundary markers. He believed holding position there would slow what he described as the forest's attention. This is not mythologized in the record. It is stated plainly. He did not return. As the charges detonated, witnesses described the ground responding, not collapsing, but rippling. Silence spread outward like a pressure wave. Several men entered the river voluntarily, moving calmly, without fear. They were not recovered. The remaining team escaped by boat. Engine failure occurred once more, restarted without repair. Timekeeping devices disagreed sharply. Watches differed by hours. When rescue finally arrived, debriefings began immediately. And this is where the official story was rewritten. The mission was reclassified as a hostile engagement with armed groups. Losses attributed to combat and environmental hazards. The discovered facility was described as unsafe infrastructure, cleared for security reasons. No mention was made of behavioral influence. No mention of silence events. No mention of samples or older research. Survivors were warned against speculation. Records were sealed. Careers continued. Years later, a reservoir flooded the region. The site disappeared beneath water. Reports from nearby towns followed. Confusion. People walking into water at night, getting lost in familiar places, minor incidents, no pattern officially acknowledged. But the signs remained consistent. Silence, disorientation, metallic taste during rain. Those symptoms appear in multiple unrelated accounts decades apart. Which raises a final question. If the environment was neutralized, why do the effects persist? And if it was not neutralized, what exactly was buried under that reservoir? By the time fragments of the 1961 mission became public, the Cold War had ended. The urgency that once justified risk had faded. But the documents read differently in hindsight. The tribes were never warning about a creature, or a curse, or even danger in the conventional sense. They were warning about systems that remember, interaction. Modern science acknowledges networked organisms, mycelial communication, chemical signaling across vast distances, influence without intention. What remains unresolved is scale. The records suggest planners encountered something they could not isolate, could not weaponize, and could not fully erase. So they submerged it, changed the narrative, moved on. But environments do not reset when paperwork does. The Amazon did not retaliate. It adapted. And adaptation does not require malice. It only requires exposure. Today, similar language appears in discussions about AI systems, social networks, and emergent behavior. Influence without awareness. Choice shaped before cognition. The parallel is uncomfortable. The tribes understood something modern planners did not. Boundaries are not always about territory. Sometimes they are about interaction limits. Crossing them does not trigger punishment. It triggers learning. The final debrief of the mission ends with a sentence rarely quoted. Local knowledge proved contextually accurate, but operationally inconvenient. That inconvenience cost lives, and it left behind a question that still has no answer. If a system learns from human presence and continues learning after we leave, how do we know when we are no longer the ones making decisions? And more importantly, how many other warnings have we dismissed because they did not fit the language of our instruments? Some lines are not marked on maps, they are remembered, and once crossed, they do not always move back. For years after the 1961 Amazon mission, the incident existed only as an internal anomaly, a failed operation, a compromised environment, a lesson quietly archived. But patterns do not stay isolated. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, U.S. military and research agencies began encountering similar issues in entirely different environments. Not jungles, not rivers, but systems designed by humans. Operators reported decision hesitation that could not be traced to stress, navigation errors without equipment failure, groups making collectively poor choices despite clear information. Investigators blamed fatigue, morale, training gaps. What makes the comparison unsettling is not the similarity of symptoms, but the similarity of language. Across unrelated reports, analysts used the same phrases found in the Amazon documents: behavioral drift, delayed recognition, selection errors preceding awareness. In one Cold War-era study on underground command facilities, planners observed that personnel inside certain environments began favoring actions that prolonged exposure rather than reduced it. Even when exit protocols were clear, some crews delayed evacuation during drills without realizing why. No environmental toxins were found, no coercion, no direct threat. The explanation offered was subtle cognitive load. The conclusion was filed as inconclusive. But in internal correspondence, one analyst asked a question that mirrors the Amazon warnings almost exactly. At what point does a system stop reacting to human input and begin shaping it? That question never reached publication. Instead, the research focus shifted. Environmental influence was reframed as human error. Biological networks were separated from behavioral outcomes. Compartmentalization returned. Yet the Amazon case refused to disappear entirely. Small clusters of incidents continued to surface near large water projects. Reservoirs, flooded valleys, artificial lakes built over biologically dense terrain. Reports were always minor. Confusion, people walking into water, time distortion complaints. Nothing actionable until you align them. When analysts did, one trend emerged. Areas where older ecosystems had been disturbed, submerged, or repurposed without full understanding showed higher rates of unexplained behavioral incidents than comparable regions. This was correlation, not proof. But intelligence agencies do not ignore correlations. They bury them when they complicate doctrine. One former researcher later described the Amazon project not as a failure, but as a warning prototype. Evidence that some systems could not be isolated or controlled because interaction itself was the variable. The tribes had drawn boundaries because they understood that repeated contact changed outcomes. Modern institutions assumed observation was neutral. It was not. By the 1980s, funding for similar environmental influence studies quietly disappeared. Not cancelled, redirected, the language changed. Network effects, emergent behavior, non-linear response systems. The Amazon was no longer mentioned, but its logic remained. If a system can learn from repeated human presence, then absence is not a reset. It is merely a pause. And pauses, as history shows, end. So the question becomes unavoidable. Was the Amazon incident unique, or was it simply the first time the warning was written down? Every investigation eventually reaches a limit, a point where more data does not clarify. It complicates. The 1961 Amazon mission crossed that point quietly. No final report explains the phenomenon conclusively. No document claims discovery or containment. Instead, the record thins. References fade. Language softens. Responsibility disperses. That absence is the most revealing detail of all. When institutions encounter something they cannot model, they do not always deny it. Sometimes they remove it from decision space entirely. The tribes never did that. They accepted that some environments respond to interaction in ways that cannot be predicted. Their boundaries were not defensive. They were preventative. Limits placed not to protect people from danger, but to protect balance from disruption. Modern systems work differently. They assume that enough observation, enough data, enough iteration will eventually grant control. The Amazon incident suggests a different outcome, that some systems do not resist control. They absorb it. The men who entered the forest did not face an enemy. They faced a feedback loop they did not recognize until it was already shaping them. That is why the most unsettling detail is not the disappearances. It is the decision-making drift. People did not panic. They did not rebel. They complied, sometimes against their own survival. They walked into water calmly. They delayed exits. They prioritized continuation over withdrawal. Those are not signs of fear. They are signs of influence. Today, we recognize similar patterns in non-biological systems. Algorithms that guide choice without issuing commands. Environments that shape behavior subtly, persistently, invisibly. We call this optimization. But optimization always has a reference point. The Amazon case suggests that when the reference point shifts without notice, agency becomes difficult to define. That is why the warning still matters. Not because the forest was alive in a way we imagine life, but because it functioned as a system that learned faster than the humans studying it. When the reservoir flooded the site, planners assumed submersion meant erasure. But water does not erase networks, it connects them. Reports from the region never stopped entirely. They just stayed small, local, easy to dismiss. Silence events, disorientation. The same metallic taste reported during rain. No single incident proved anything. Together, they formed a pattern no institution wanted to own. The tribes understood something modern systems still struggle with. Some lines exist not because crossing them is forbidden, but because crossing them changes you in ways you cannot measure until it is too late. The Amazon did not need to be hostile. It only needed time. And the unsettling possibility is not that the warning was ignored once. It's that it may still be ignored. Every time we assume interaction is harmless simply because it is familiar. If a system remembers contact, then history is not behind us. It is ongoing. And the question that remains is not whether the tribes were right. It is whether we are still walking forward, confidently, into systems that are already learning how we choose.